After a great win, I'm not all that good, and after a bad loss, I'm not all that bad.
The chairs were still warm. That is the detail that stays with you when you think about what happened at Hard Rock Stadium in the days after Alex Eala's exit from the 2026 Miami Open. Section after section of seats that had been draped in Philippine flags just days earlier, packed with fans who had flown thousands of miles and had absolutely no intention of being quiet about it, now sat unclaimed in the Florida afternoon sun. The tournament was still going, matches were still being played, but something had left the building, and everyone who had been paying attention knew exactly what it was. What Eala posted on social media within 48 hours of walking off that court after a 6-0, 6-2 defeat turned a painful loss into the clearest proof yet of something that two major tournaments had now independently confirmed. The Eala Effect is real, it is documented, and it is not going away. If you want to follow this story as it develops through the clay season and beyond, with the depth and the detail it deserves, subscribe to this channel now and hit the bell. We cover the WTA and the Alex Eala story the way it should be covered, closely, seriously, and without shortcuts. Now let us get into what actually happened in Miami and why it matters. Eala arrived at the 2026 Miami Open as the defending semifinalist. She was a seeded player this time, not a wild card, not an underdog who nobody had penciled in for a deep run. She came in carrying real expectations and a record at this specific tournament that the draw genuinely respected, and she backed that status up early. She won her first match against Laura Siegemund cleanly. Then she followed it up with a composed, controlled 6-3, 7-6, 6-2 dismissal of Magda Linette, a player with years of Grand Slam results and serious experience behind her name. Both victories were played inside an atmosphere that was, in purely visual and audio terms, unlike anything happening on the courts around her at the same time. The stands during her matches did not feel like neutral ground. They felt like somewhere specific, somewhere that belonged to one community that had decided this was their tournament and their player, and they were going to make sure everyone within earshot knew it. The flags were visible on the broadcast feed. The noise carried across to adjacent courts. Social media clips began circulating within hours of the final points being played. What was building in those stands was not just enthusiasm, it was something organized, something sustained, and something that was growing with each round. Then came the round of 16. Then came Karolína Muchová. The scoreline read 6-0, 6-2. Muchová was efficient and clinical and gave Eala no room to find her rhythm. The match had no real turning points because it never got close enough for turning points to matter. A Miami run that had been building real momentum ended on a Tuesday afternoon, and the tournament moved forward to its next round as tournaments always do. That is when the commentary started arriving from the fans who had been in those stands, people who had watched every Eala match from the first round and tracked the energy inside the stadium throughout the week, began documenting what they observed after she left. More empty seats, quieter grounds, a drop in the atmosphere that had defined the opening days of the tournament that felt measurable to anyone paying attention. Filipino fan accounts across social media platforms named it clearly and directly. Something had departed when she departed. The footage existed. The before and after contrast was visible to anyone who looked. No official statement from the Miami Open or the WTA was needed to confirm what fans across multiple platforms were independently observing and sharing. What gave this observation its real weight was that it was not happening for the first time. 3 weeks ago at Indian Wells, the exact same sequence had played out with the same precision. Eala in the draw, crowds building to a specific and distinct energy, Eala eliminated, and then the grounds thinning in ways that fan coverage and documentary footage captured in real time. Headlines referenced nearly 58,000 fans departing from subsequent sessions after her exit from that tournament. The footage existed, the reaction existed, the pattern existed. Miami had not invented the Eala effect. Miami had simply confirmed that it was not going away. To understand what is actually being described here, it helps to think about it from the perspective of a tournament operations team. You have access to the footage, you can walk the grounds and observe session energy across an afternoon, you are reading fan commentary arriving in 3 or 4 languages simultaneously, and you are reaching the same conclusion that thousands of people in those stands had already reached within hours of her exit. One player had been generating a disproportionate share of the atmosphere inside your tournament, and her absence was immediate, visible, and documented by sources that had no particular interest in making a commercial argument on anyone's behalf. They were just fans describing what they had seen with their own eyes. The supporters who noticed this and documented it deserve to have what they built recognized directly. The fans who purchased flights before the draw was even published, who coordinated their travel around a player's potential route through a bracket, who turned South Florida courts into something that felt unmistakably tied to one community and impossible to ignore even on a broadcast feed. They did not simply create noise, they created evidence. The Eala Effect belongs to them. They built it match by match, section by section, and every empty chair after March 24th was a confirmation of what they had constructed long before the Miami Open sessions began. And then Eala posted, within 48 hours of a 0-6-0-2 defeat, the kind of result that sends most professional players into carefully guarded and minimal press interactions, she went directly to social media, not to address the loss, not to comment on Muchová. She addressed Miami itself. She wrote that she could confirm Miami was still the best and that this tournament would always have a special place in her heart. That sentence does not come from a player performing gratitude for a public audience. It comes from someone who genuinely felt what those stands gave her throughout the week and sent it back in the same spirit it arrived. The effect runs in both directions. The fans brought something to those courts, and she felt it, and she said so. That post is its own form of evidence. It is worth pausing to consider what Paul Annacone said about Eala earlier in the 2026 season, because placed alongside the footage from Hard Rock Stadium, his words read less like a compliment and more like a precise diagnosis of something structural. Annacone spent 30 years operating inside professional tennis at its highest level. He coached Pete Sampras through the final phase of a Grand Slam era that ended with 14 major titles. He worked alongside Roger Federer's team during a period when every decision Federer made was scrutinized by the entire sport. His credibility was built not by winning titles himself, but by identifying the qualities that allow others to win, and by understanding the difference between a player who is technically excellent and a player who genuinely changes the temperature of a room when they enter it. What Annacone said about Eala was that she has a smile that lights up a room and that she carries herself with grace and humility. On the surface, that sounds like a warm observation about a pleasant person. But what he was actually identifying, the quality that changes the atmosphere of a space when a particular person enters it, is precisely the quality that makes a tournament feel different when she steps onto the court. Fans do not organize international travel, coordinate flag arrivals, and fill sections to capacity for hours before a match begins because a player has strong serve statistics or good breakpoint conversion numbers. They do it because they feel something when that player is present. Annacone identified the thing they feel. The empty chairs at Miami were what the tournament grounds registered when that thing was no longer there. Now compress the sequence that ran from Indian Wells through Miami and look at it as a single pattern. At Indian Wells in 2026, Eala was on court and the stands packed around her with a loud and documented Filipino presence. She was eliminated. Fan coverage flooded in immediately. Documented headlines referenced tens of thousands of fans absent from subsequent sessions. Atmosphere thinned. 3 weeks later at Miami, rounds 2 and 3 produced the same full stands, the same density of noise, the same flags on the broadcast feed. She lost in the round of 16. The following sessions across the grounds were visibly quieter. 2 premier American hardcourt events, 45 days apart, the same player, the same departure, and the same independently documented aftermath. This is not a claim built on a single observation or a single tournament. It is a repeating sequence with 2 major events as its evidence base. What does that mean practically for the tournaments that follow? The clay season is the next chapter of this story. Stuttgart, Madrid, Rome, and Roland Garros in late May. Each of those tournaments is about to encounter what the two American hardcourt events learned on their own timelines, without having been fully prepared for it. An Eala entry in the draw does not simply mean a seeded competitor filling a slot in the bracket. It means a pre-sold atmospheric condition that no other current name on the WTA Tour consistently replicates at this scale. The Filipino community that travels to support her is internationally mobile, genuinely passionate, and organized in a way that shows up not just in the noise level during matches, but in the visible and measurable contrast when she is no longer in the building. Whether the effect carries across to European red clay is the question that defines the next 4 months of this story. The tactical demands on clay shift significantly. The physical conditions are different. The surfaces challenge players in ways that hardcourt does not, and a player whose game has been built primarily on the hardcourts will need to adapt. The crowds that filled Indian Wells in Miami will need to find their way to Stuttgart, Madrid, and Paris. That is not impossible. The Filipino diaspora is spread across Europe as well as the Americas, but it is a new test, and the honest answer is that nobody knows yet whether the pattern will extend 3 continents or find its limits somewhere in Europe. Either way, the documentation is now live, and the next test is scheduled. And before the clay season begins, it is worth sitting with what Eala said after losing to Muchová, because the way she handled it revealed something important. She took no shortcuts in her post-match comments. She was direct and clear. She said she was still really happy about her week, and then she said something that is worth remembering. She said that after a great win, she is not all that good, and after a bad loss, she is not all that bad, and that she has to look at everything as objectively as she can. That is not a prepared media answer. That is a person who has developed a genuine internal framework for processing results without being destabilized by them in either direction. She does not get carried away by wins. She does not collapse under losses. She looks at what happened, takes what is useful, and moves forward. And then, 48 hours later, she was publicly declaring her love for the tournament that had just sent her home in a 0-6, 0-2 defeat. The scoreline was real. So was everything that surrounded it and followed it. The packed stands during the Lynette match, the flags on the railings visible from the broadcast cameras, the documented before and after shift in grounds energy following March 24th, the identical sequence at Indian Wells 45 days earlier, same tournament infrastructure, same player, same departure, and the same independently documented aftermath. And then, within 48 hours of the worst scoreline of her Miami campaign, the words, "This tournament will always have a special place in my heart." That sequence does not describe a player who happened to win a few matches and draw some crowds. It describes something that 2 premier tournaments encountered without fully anticipating and documented through absence as much as through presence. The Eala Effect is confirmed not by a press release, not by an official attendance report from the Miami Open, but by the footage, the fan commentary across multiple platforms, the reporting from outlets that were watching closely, the YouTube documentation, and the social media post written from a player directly to a city that sent her home with warmth rather than indifference. The fans who packed those Florida courts before any ranking number justified the energy they brought were not premature in their investment. They were not over the top or misreading the moment. They were correct. They understood what she means inside a stadium before the broader tennis world had caught up to that understanding. The empty chairs proved exactly what those fans had always known and felt and shown up every day to demonstrate. There is a broader question sitting underneath all of this that is worth asking directly. Is Alex Eala already the biggest crown draw in women's tennis right now? The evidence from 2 consecutive major hardcourt events points strongly in that direction. No other current name on the WTA Tour is generating this kind of documented atmospheric impact at this scale and with this consistency. That is not a criticism of any other player. It is simply an observation about what is happening in the stands when Eala plays and what happens to those stands when she leaves.
The more complicated question is whether the effect will shift once she is consistently carrying the expectations of a favorite rather than the energy of an ascending player still proving herself. Right now, there is a momentum to her story, a sense of something still being built, a narrative arc that fans feel invested in because the destination is not yet known. As she climbs higher in the rankings and her results at major tournaments become harder to surprise people with, the dynamic will change. The question of whether the crowns follow the ranking or the person will be answered over the next year or two, and it is genuinely interesting. What Indian Wells and Miami together have shown is that the Filipino fanbase has now run a live, unplanned, and unsponsored experiment across 2 consecutive major events and produced documented results. A passionate and internationally mobile community attached to a single ascending player can functionally alter the session attendance and the ground's energy at premier tournaments, not through promotional campaigns or discounted tickets or organized group sales initiatives, but through genuine emotional investment in one competitor's presence. That is something rare in professional tennis and rare in professional sport more broadly. Tournament directors notice it. Broadcasters notice it, and the players who share courts with her during those weeks notice it too. Stuttgart is coming, Madrid is coming, Roland Garros is coming, and the next chapter of this story is already scheduled. The clay courts of Europe are about to find out what Hard Rock Stadium and the Indian Wells Tennis Garden found out in 2026. Whether you frame it as the Eala Effect or simply as what happens when a player means something genuine to a community that decides to show up for her everywhere she goes, it is the most interesting ongoing story in women's tennis right now. The empty chairs in Miami were not a sad ending, they were a confirmation of something that is still building, and the best parts of this story have not happened yet. If you want to be in the room when they do, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We cover the WTA and Alex Eala's journey the way it deserves to be covered, with the depth, the detail, and the respect for what is actually happening in those stands. Be here for Stuttgart, be here for Madrid, be here for Roland Garros. Every day is match point.